Joseph Newton Chandler, a loner living in the suburbs with a big secret.
Always had a suitcase packed. He was always ready to go.
Hiding his true identity for decades.
Why did he run away from his family and change his identity and live like this?
His name stolen, his family abandoned.
Was he paranoid because he knew he owed mom all that money, or was he paranoid about what had happened in California?
What was this man running from? Was he a fugitive, a notorious serial killer, or did he just want a fresh start?
You have just a normal guy, or do you have the Zodiac Killer?
So why do you come to Cleveland in 1978? What are you running from and where are you?
After years, a break in the case thanks to new DNA technology.
We had a little bit of real bad DNA. So it was kind of like a Hail Mary play.
Chandler's real name revealed, but will it be enough to find out why he was hiding?
A great mystery there.
I'm Sara Goldenberg. I'm taking you inside this man's double life and the search for answers in our latest episode of Dark Side of the Land. It was a hot, humid July day back in 2002. The heat hung heavy in the air, and air conditioners hummed across Northeast Ohio. In the small city of Eastlake, about 20 miles from Cleveland, along the shore of Lake Erie, something wasn't quite right. A strong odor drifted out of a small beige apartment lined up next to other apartments that all looked the same. The landlord called police.
Just flies, covering the windows of the apartment.
The odor was so bad, officers borrowed gas masks from firefighters to get through the door.
It was a studio apartment, so it just had a bed that came out of the wall, a small kitchen area, a bathroom to the right.
Ted Krozak was a detective with Eastlake Police at the time. He's now retired. He knew from experience what he would likely find next.
Came up to the bathroom, looked inside the bathroom, and saw the body on the floor, almost in a face down, fetal type position.
The body was so badly decomposed, the person was unrecognizable.
But as I lifted the body, we did notice that there was a handgun underneath the body.
At this point, all of the clues pointed to a suicide, but something seemed out of place.
We noticed just some odd things about the apartment. Who was living there lived like a super simple life. Very little clothing, very little personal items, I think in the closet there was like one jacket and maybe a tie.
Nothing stood out about this person's life in a run-of-the-mill efficiency apartment with white walls and brown carpet. A few wooden cabinets lined a small kitchen with a table that doubled as a desk against the wall. A computer sat on the table and a suitcase sat on the floor, across from a bookshelf and a bed.
So as we went through the apartment, we were able to find the wallet and identification, things like that.
The Ohio license read Joseph Newton Chandler III.
Everything we had, everything we looked at that was in the apartment was to Joseph Chandler. It even got to a point where we did a little more follow-up, and Mr. Chandler used to walk to a restaurant that was right next door called Next Family Restaurant, almost on a daily basis to eat and come back. So we were pretty positive we had the right individual identified that died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the bathroom. And we had no other information at that point that it was anybody but Joseph Chandler.
A week earlier, Chandler had locked all of his doors, shut the windows, and shot himself in the head. It turns out he had colon cancer at the time. Here's Eastlake Police Chief Larry Reich.
Once everything matches up, you kind of get it all filed away, and there's no forcible entry into the house. There's nothing else to really look at.
Everything seemed to fit, that it was pretty much just a suicide at that point.
Police were pretty confident this man was Joseph Chandler, but they didn't have any fingerprints on the body to make a match, and no other clues either. They searched his apartment, but found no list of emergency contacts or doctor notes.
They found very little, and what they did find didn't really lead to anything for a 100%, okay, this is definitely who this was.
They spoke to his coworkers and found Chandler seemed to be a loner and didn't have many friends.
So it completed an investigation as you would expect for a suicide with a guy with a wallet, with everything else corresponding.
But something was still missing. Where was this man's family? After some more digging, detectives uncovered a secret. The man living a quiet, simple life in that tiny apartment had concealed for decades. Here's U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott.
Is they figured out he had $82,000 in his bank account, and they went to locate his next of kin, and the next of kin unveiled that the real Joseph Newton Chandler died in 1945.
Joseph Chandler, or the individual we had that committed suicide, took the identity of a deceased child. And then it started snowballing from there.
Who was the real Joseph Newton Chandler? And what did this man have to hide? Investigators learned Joseph Newton Chandler III was an 8-year-old boy from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He died tragically in a car accident with his family before Christmas in Texas back in 1945. We found an old newspaper article from the Tulsa Tribune featuring a smiling black and white photo of the real Joseph's parents. The newspaper said they were on their way to visit family in Weatherford, Texas, when they died in a car crash.
Was that surprising to you when you heard that he had stolen someone's identity?
Yeah, I found it unusual. I was like, I wonder why he would have did that. Yeah.
People aren't going to live in a very nondescript apartment complex, simple studio apartment without much means for no reason. There just has to be something more to it.
Even if you took on another identity, why would you live a life like that, you know?
Try to get into his mind a little bit. He knows that he had someone else's identity. He knew he was committing suicide. So what is he going to do before he does that? Likely clean up the place and leave as little of his own evidence there.
As little evidence as possible. That's exactly what this man, living under the name Joseph Chandler, left behind for detectives. Luckily, they'd taken extra photos of the scene and had a full case file ready for the next unexpected step of the investigation.
The question is, why? So why do you come to Cleveland in 1978? Why do you live under the name of a 8-year-old boy who died in 1945 in a car accident?
Why did this man choose this child's name to steal, and what was he running from? U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott picked up the case file 10 years after the man known as Joseph Chandler was found dead in Eastlake. Elliott's dad, a retired deputy U.S. Marshal, had worked the case.
Yeah, he had worked on it as a private investigator in the past. I don't remember the year, but he still had the report, so I remember reaching out to him.
What stood out to you about this case?
It was unsolved, number one. Number two, it was probably, at that time, I think it was one of Cleveland's top 10 most unsolvable cases, right? And so those are the type of cases that we wanted to take a look at, because we thought that whoever would utilize the name of an 8-year-old boy who died in 1945 and lived here in the Cleveland area for all those years was hiding from something.
Could the U.S. Marshal uncover this man's true identity?
You had this mystery that, nobody knew his true identity and why he was hiding.
They started combing through the evidence and trying to trace what they could. During our interview, Marshal Elliott actually brought out some of that evidence and laid it on a table, next to printed copies of photos and other documents from the investigation.
That's his watch, that's a gun that he used. We actually found that gun originally, they thought traced to Texas, but it did trace back to Ohio. It was bought 3 months before he committed suicide by him in Lake County. Glasses, this is some kind of ruby fluid that he had in his possession. Everything here we traced. So we actually, and everything can be traced, so we actually traced this originally back to the manufacturing company and where it was sold out of Columbus, Ohio. So we don't have further details on where it was sold from and the area it was sold from in Columbus, which could put him in Columbus at some point. We're just not 100% sure. Books he had in his possession, we fingerprinted all the books, making money with your computer at home, how to make money in the stock market, fingerprinted every one of those pages at that time and received no fingerprints, which would have helped out a lot.
In fact, no fingerprints were found anywhere in his apartment.
Is that unusual?
It's happened before, so typically you want to, be able to get fingerprints. If we had fingerprints, it would have been a lot easier.
U.S. Marshals tracked down when and where this man got Joseph Chandler's Social Security card.
We knew he had to go missing before 1978 because he assumed the identity of Chandler in South Dakota, Rapid City, South Dakota, in 1978.
Marshal Elliott started looking at unsolved fugitive cases from the 60s and 70s across the country, starting in San Francisco with the infamous Alcatraz prison escapees. All they had was that driver's license photo of the man known as Joseph Chandler from the 1990s and some very basic information. In the photo, he had white hair and was wearing square glasses, a crisp white shirt, a striped tie, and a light gray jacket.
So we knew his height. His height was 5'7". That was what was listed on his driver's license. We knew an approximate age of him, which we were able to ascertain, and that matched up with one of the escapees. So we took a look at that to figure out if we can get DNA off one of the relatives.
But how could they match the DNA from one of the relatives of the Alcatraz escapees to the man who died under Joseph Chandler's name when he had been cremated years before? U.S. Marshals found Chandler had undergone surgery.
But in Ohio, they're required to keep tissue samples for 7 years after somebody has a procedure.
So they pulled his medical records and found an untested DNA sample.
We were able to get that DNA sample and then had that tested here in Cuyahoga County. So now we had DNA. So we were able to put that in a national system called CODIS, but we got no hits back. So then we started going individually to different places and trying to get DNA from relatives of people that we thought Chandler could be.
U.S. Marshals tracked down other leads, too. From California to Wyoming and back to Ohio, the list of fugitives he could have been stacked up.
What does that feel like when you think you have it, but you hit a dead end?
You're feeling good about it. You're thinking that, hey, this is it. This is going to be who he really is. And then you just hit a dead end. It's like, go back at it.
After a few years of searching, U.S. Marshals still didn't have any answers. They did rule some theories out, though. This man wasn't an escapee from Alcatraz or any of their other suspects.
Frustrating times because, its success is going from failure to failure with great enthusiasm. And we were so close sometimes and thought, this has to be him.
I'm Sara Goldenberg. You're listening to Dark Side of the Land. In 2016, a phone call changed everything. U.S. Marshals took a big risk on DNA that paid off.
So I heard about this forensic genealogist in California, and we just made a call to her and said, hey, look, can you help us? I don't know enough about forensic genealogy. Can you help us on this? We have this tissue sample. It's badly degraded. We got nothing in CODIS, the national system.
Yes, he reached out to me to do the
Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick has a PhD in nuclear physics. She's a pioneer in the field of investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, and she founded Identifinders International. She took a look at the degraded DNA profile. We spoke to her over Zoom. She sat in her office, stacked high with papers around the room.
He gave me the YSTR profile that the crime lab had created, and I compared it to the genetic genealogy databases.
Fitzpatrick worked on the case with Dr. Margaret Press. They went on to co-found the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit that uses DNA technology and genealogy to identify John and Jane Does. They wanted to try a new technique used for adoptees looking for their birth parents for unsolved cases like this.
So I can imagine, two little old ladies coming to him saying, we can solve this case. And he's thinking, well, I'll try anything. This was brand new. Nobody had brought it up yet.
Fitzpatrick already had a starting point. She called the man known as Joseph Chandler Mr. X, and his DNA hits matched the last name of Nichols or Nicholas. Now they had a true last name, and she found a genealogist in the Nicholas family who had traced his ancestors back.
It was kind of interesting because that genealogist traced his genealogy back to colonial Virginia.
All the way back to the 1700s to a prominent family with thousands of descendants. Fitzpatrick and Press wanted to do a workaround to find the real identity of Joseph Chandler, since they couldn't use private genealogy databases like Ancestry and 23andMe. They decided to try a public ancestry database using this SNP testing method, now known as investigative genetic genealogy.
In other words, you have DNA from somebody and you don't know who it is. You get them tested, they look at the matches, you build a family tree, you figure out who they are.
They were one step ahead with his last name, but there was another major challenge.
We didn't have fresh DNA. We had a little bit of real bad DNA. So it was kind of like a Hail Mary play because, first of all, this had only been used for medical reasons until now. We were using it for forensics. Number two, usually you have tons of good DNA to look at and work with, and we had just a little bit of real lousy DNA. And third, we didn't know, even if we got the data, whether GEDmatch and all the matching algorithms would still work because we had big holes in our data. We didn't have a nice big genome, it was big holes. In fact, there's only 12% of the whole DNA came out, only 12% of the SNPs.
So Fitzpatrick experimented, degrading her own DNA and uploading that profile to GEDmatch. She found the data still worked. She still got her family matches. Now they were ready to upload his DNA profile. A number of matches came back for the man known as Joseph Chandler, or Mr. X, under the last name Nichols or Nicholas. They found third and fourth cousins, but they were too distant. 2 years into it, Fitzpatrick and Press took a gamble using the last bit of DNA extract. It paid off, leading them to a new relative match.
So we get really excited. We keep building these trees. And then somebody notices there's a Mr. Nichols with, I think, 3 or 4 sons. And the mother and daughter connected to him, and the new match connected to a Mrs. Nichols.
They had noticed this family in the large tree of relatives before, and that's where the deeper investigation into them started.
We had the birth, marriage, death of 3 sons, but we couldn't find the death of the 4th son. So we started looking at him better, more closely. Turned out that we had a lot of documentation on Mr. X along the way, since he changed his identity.
They found an address on a rental application from Joseph Chandler where he listed a sister as a reference, a sister who supposedly lived in Columbus at 1823 Center Street. It was the same address as the 4th Nichols son's house where he was born, 1823 Center Street, but in New Albany, Indiana.
It was the same address. So what happened is Mr. X used it on that rental application because it's an address he could remember. And so that really made us think we had the right guy. So we started digging into that guy's history. We got his high school graduation picture. We had his military records. He had married. He was divorced. He had 3 sons. 1 was deceased.
1 son lived in Ohio. The other lived in Georgia. Fitzpatrick shared this news with the volunteers working on the case.
So the whole Facebook group, everybody, the website lights up. We think we have it. So I called Margaret. I said, get your butt out of bed right now. So she gets up, and we work all night trying to prove this, make sure we didn't make a mistake.
After more than 1,500 hours of science and research, even help from the DNA matches themselves, everything lined up. It was DNA Doe Project's first solve. Early the next morning, Fitzpatrick and Press called U.S. Marshal Pete Elliott.
I said, well, I have some good news and bad news. I said, he's not from Oklahoma like we thought he was. He's really from Indiana. And Margaret says, we solved it, and his name is Robert Ivan Nichols. And the marshal was like, oh my God,
All of this from a degraded tissue sample.
It was the first case in the history of U.S. Marshal Service that we utilized forensic genealogy to solve a case.
Who was this man? The man who stole the identity of Joseph Chandler. Robert Ivan Nichols was born in southern Indiana in 1926, right across the Ohio River from Louisville, Kentucky.
So she was able to come with his family tree and say, hey, this is who this person was. And that's good, but we need a little more, right?
It turns out tracking down one of the sons of Robert Ivan Nichols wouldn't be hard to do. He was living in the same state. But would that bring U.S. Marshals any closer to figuring out why Robert left and started a new life as Joseph? Phil Nichols was living a simple life in a sober living house in Cincinnati.
And it's been a blessing for me. Getting sober was the best thing I could do in my life.
But one day, a knock at his door from U.S. Marshals changed everything, making him rethink his whole childhood and everything he thought he knew about his father and his family.
So my neighbor that lives on this first floor, he said, "Bill, you got somebody at the front door." I said, "Okay." So I come down.
And I looked through the glass, and I thought I was looking right at Joseph Newton Chandler.
And I'm thinking, what is this? And right away, they identified themselves, and he said, "First thing we want to let you know is you're not in any trouble." What they had in the Cleveland area was this Joseph Newton Chandler had committed suicide. They couldn't find an accurate history, so now they're trying to find out, who is this man? Has he left a trail of all this missing time?
So we showed him the picture, and he said, "That's my dad." He hasn't seen it since, again, early 1960s.
How did that moment feel?
That felt good because we were finally there, right? But with that said, we were at the first step.
They now know Joseph Chandler's real identity is Robert Nichols, once a DNA sample from Phil gets confirmed by the lab. But the big question is, why did Robert run and live under a stolen identity for decades? For that, they needed to go back to the beginning.
I'm rolling if you want.
Follow signs for I-64 West.
So we did too, tracing Robert's roots. Photographer Chris Klein and I took a road trip through Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky to learn more about Robert's early life. First, we stopped in Cincinnati, just like U.S. Marshals did, to talk to Robert's son, Phil. The city sits in a valley surrounded by rolling hills overlooking the Ohio River and the Kentucky state line. We stopped at a simple 2-story house with white siding and a front porch on a crowded street to meet Phil.
Sarah, you might want to go ahead. I'm in the car.
No problem.
In this sober living home, he shares with several other men struggling with sobriety like he once did.
And I can remember really well back to about 3 years old, at least 4.
Phil sat at a kitchen table with us, holding a coffee mug as we talked. He had white hair and wore square glasses, a lot like his father once wore. He was happy to take us through his early childhood and share memories of his father.
It was a great place growing up.
It's nice that it's in good shape.
Robert Ivan Nichols, the son of Silas and Alpha, was born in a small, modest white house in 1926 in New Albany, Indiana, near the Ohio River just across from Louisville, Kentucky. It's a river town full of charm and history. Robert grew up with 2 brothers and went to New Albany High School.
That garage, that white.
There used to be a door here.
We visited New Albany ourselves and checked out some of these places, eventually ending up at the Floyd County Library to comb through their archives in the Indiana History Room. We looked through newspaper archives with the help of the librarian to see if anything new came up on Robert Nichols, but we didn't find anything. Next, we checked out the old yearbooks from New Albany High School and had better luck. We found Robert Nichols in a yearbook from back in 1944 and a group picture of him with the school choir. That was a pivotal year for him. That spring, Robert joined the Navy, just like his older brother, and served in the Pacific on a ship.
And I would ask about that. They told me he was a fireman. But what that meant was that he fed the furnaces, kept the engines running.
In 1945, the Japanese attacked his ship.
So the attacks were severe. And then of course, they brought in the kamikaze.
Robert was on the worst hit part of the ship with 15 other men. Only 4 survived. He later told his hometown newspaper, "It was 52 minutes of hell, and death stared me in the face." Robert rushed to help the other sailors, not noticing he was injured himself.
Dad was knocked down, he was wounded. He caught a lot of shrapnel.
Robert later received a Purple Heart. He would never forget what he experienced that day.
Of course, nowadays they recognize that PTSD is a real thing.
Robert never talked about it. Phil only knew the story of what happened when his dad got back from his grandmother.
He gets back, he threw his uniforms in the coal bin at home.
Burning that uniform, Phil says, wasn't him being unpatriotic. He had just become a pacifist.
He loved this country, but he hated the war.
Back in New Albany, Robert stayed busy playing in a band and square dancing.
He was playing stand-up bass. And they had a 3 or 4 piece band, him and a couple other guys.
That's how he met his wife, Laverne Corti.
She would go to the dances with Grandpa. Dad was playing as a band, and that's how they met, was at one of those dances. Apparently, I look back and count the days and the months and everything. It wasn't too long before they were married, and then it wasn't too much longer after that before I was born.
Phil's story, just like his dad's, starts in New Albany, Indiana, in this same house on Center Street.
I'd take off and 4 or 5 years old, I'm running around over through the woods, and one of my big adventures, like I say, at 4 or 5 years old, and still on a tricycle, I would get out and just ride around the neighborhood. That was a fairly pleasant time in my life.
His dad spent a lot of time tinkering in the garage.
But that's where Dad built his kayak and his machine gun, and all that was in that garage.
But the rest of their family memories would be made somewhere else.
New Albany was a good experience. We lived there until I was in the 2nd grade. I started a new school in the 2nd grade.
They moved across the river for his dad's new job at a GE plant in Kentucky. His dad was an engineer, an industrial draftsman.
And then when we did move to Louisville, fortunately, it was still all county then, and there were farms and woods and creeks and so on, and that's where I spent my time there. I guess I picked up being a loner from my dad, but I could go over in the woods at 10 years old, climb up in a tree and spend the whole day there, that kind of thing.
They lived in a quiet neighborhood with a suburban feel.
We would go on camping trips, which I loved. Once again, out in the woods, Every so often, Dad would take us to a ball game.
But then things started to change.
Dad would be there in the evenings. He worked days at GE, and he would be there in the evenings and on weekends, and had very little interaction with us. And by this time, there's 3 of us, 3 boys in a row. Things within the home were deteriorating. Mom and Dad were always good about where the Cleavers were the perfect 50s family, to the public. But behind doors, it was a totally different thing.
1964 was a pivotal year for Robert Nichols. It's the year he left his family, left Kentucky, and started over. Robert and Laverne split up.
Well, first he bought a new car, and then he left us. Never paid a dime in child support, not a dime. Left us with a mortgage on the house, an old beat-up Chevrolet, and 3 kids in school. I think Dad had been planning this for a little while. We're still talking 50s and 60s. In those days, usually Mom was at home, but he encouraged her to go out and get a job.
Robert took his engineering skills up north to Dearborn, Michigan, where he worked for a company that designed race cars. One time, out of nowhere, he bought his kids bus tickets to come up and visit.
But kept us in a motel. And certainly he must have had an apartment somewhere.
Looking back as an adult, Phil wonders why. Why a hotel? And why was that the only time they saw him in Michigan?
Why the 3 of us kids couldn't come and visit there? That was never asked, never questioned.
What was Robert's life like in Dearborn, Michigan? One letter Robert sent his parents in August of 1964 gives us a small glimpse. It reads, "My new job is going well, and they seem to like me, although it's really too early to tell. I know I'm being watched and I'll have to prove myself." Robert says he's living in a rooming house. He started going to church again. "I thought it would be a good time to start again since my moving up here was kind of a new beginning," he said. He told his parents he made many new friends in just the 2 weeks he's been there so far. Robert also said his landlord removed the phone, so the only number he could give them was his work number. "I checked today in the office and they said I could only receive emergency calls and that in most cases they would take the message and have me call back," he said. By making contacting him so difficult, was Robert already setting up his disappearance? Robert stayed in Michigan for less than a year, then told his family he was off to California.
After that, he just more or less vanished.
I'm Sara Goldenberg. You're listening to Dark Side of the Land. What happened to Robert Nichols? Why did he head west and then disappear off the map? His mother never stopped looking for him, and even after his death, U.S. Marshals want answers too.
He was in Oklahoma at one point on his way to the West Coast, but then something happened.
Robert sent his parents a postcard in early 1965, stamped in Stroud, Oklahoma, a small town halfway between Tulsa and Oklahoma City, on Interstate 44, which parallels the famous Route 66. He tells them he's heading out west and not to worry. There are two things ironic or even too coincidental to miss about Robert passing through Oklahoma. For one, years later, he would steal the identity of a young boy from Tulsa, a boy with the last name Chandler, the same name as a town just miles away from Stroud, where this postcard was sent from. What, if anything, was Robert Nichols' connection to Oklahoma? At some point, he reaches out to his son Phil, now 18 and in the military, and what he sends seems like some sort of riddle.
He sent me an envelope, no letter in it. The only thing that was inside the envelope was a penny. That was postmarked Napa, California. There was no return address. And my name and address were written in two different handwritings. I wish I'd have kept it.
The last time any of his family heard from him was March 1965. Robert mailed a letter to his parents from Richmond, California, just north of San Francisco. He said he had a job and he liked living there. "Please do not worry about me," he wrote. "I am well and happy. I will write as often as I can and let you know how I am doing."
So in 65, he just disappears off the face of the earth.
A few months later, on July 4th, Robert sent a letter to a courthouse in Louisville, written in his signature handwriting, block letters in all caps, asking for a copy of his divorce papers. Why did he suddenly need them? And why was the address he gave the court in Los Angeles, not Northern California, where he told his parents he was living?
The mom and the dad searched for him for years, up until their death, and they can't find him.
They put a missing persons notice in their local newspaper, and she wrote dozens of letters to the Contra Costa County Sheriff, California Highway Patrol, the cities of San Francisco and Richmond, Salvation Army Missing Persons Unit, even the Weather Bureau in San Francisco, checking to see if there had been any severe storms he fell victim to. She also wrote to the Navy to check if he had re-enlisted. She heard back from all of these agencies, but they had no information for her at all. Years passed, and in 1971, Robert's mother got a flicker of hope.
Grandma was, she could be emotional. She was in tears, and she was saying there was a very nice lady that was trying to help her at Social Security.
She had realized if somewhere out there Robert had a job, he would be paying into Social Security.
The lady comes, looks in the files and comes back and says, "I can't tell you anything other than someone is paid into this account." But she wouldn't tell Mom what city, who the employers were, none of that. It really broke Grandma's heart because she was that close, but at least she knew there was somebody still alive.
This is where the mystery really begins for investigators. Where was Robert during this huge gap in time? From 1965, when he went out to California, to 1978, when he turned up in Ohio as Joseph Chandler. 1 year specifically stands out to Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick.
We looked at his Social Security records up through about 1976, and you could see, he was earning more and more money. And then in 77, it goes blank. In 78, Mr. Chandler's Social Security picks up. So there was a year when he went off the grid, and we don't know. We tried to find out what he could have been doing, why he disappeared.
The why continues to stump U.S. Marshals and police.
But there's still a question is why? Why did he run away from his family and change his identity and live like this?
There's a reason this individual, Robert Nichols, was running.
Back then, it was a lot easier to assume someone else's identity. Robert Nichols was 11 years older than the real Joseph Chandler. He got a copy of the boy's birth certificate from a hospital in Buffalo, New York, mailed it to Rapid City, South Dakota, and not long after, walked out of there with Chandler's Social Security card.
So he had to know something about that family to assume that kid's identity.
Robert's son Phil thinks maybe a shipmate from the Navy gave him the idea.
I could see Dad doing research, how to change a person's identity. We could go back in records, municipal records, and with the right maneuvers, I could claim that identity.
Over the years, Robert, now known as Joseph, worked as an engineering draftsman at a few different companies not far from where he lived.
He's here for 25 years, which is a big gap in years, under a fake name, working at a company under a fake name, living a life under a fake name.
The new Joseph Chandler's life in a Cleveland suburb seemed pretty ordinary, except for some strange behavior here and there. Coworkers told police he listened to white noise for hours at a time, and one day he drove to Maine just to go to an LL Bean. When he couldn't find a parking spot, he turned around and drove all the way back home.
They all thought he was odd, different, kept to himself, but they never thought in a million years that he was somebody else.
U.S. Marshals found a few red flags in his behavior, especially when coworkers said he always had a suitcase packed.
And you say that too, that, they're getting close to me, I have to go. And he would disappear for 6 months at a time. At one point, he told one of his associates that he had something to tell him one day, but he never said what that one thing was.
After news broke of Joseph Chandler's real identity, a theory took hold online and gained steam from web sleuths. They compared pictures side by side. The first photo of Robert Nichols, known as Joseph Chandler at the time, from his Ohio driver's license. The second picture was a sketch of the Zodiac Killer. In the late 1960s, the now infamous Zodiac Killer terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area. He murdered at least 5 victims and taunted police and the media, sending them letters confessing to the crimes. Many included ciphers. More than 50 years later, the identity of the Zodiac Killer still remains a mystery. Here's Eastlake Police Chief Larry Reich.
As we were spitballing different ideas of the most grandiose, do you have just a normal guy or do you have the Zodiac Killer?
Is it possible Robert Nichols was the Zodiac Killer? Back to those pictures side by side. Nichols, aka Chandler, isn't smiling. He's staring with no emotion right into the camera. He's wearing those square glasses similar to the Zodiac Killer sketch. They both have similar face shapes with broad foreheads and square jawlines, even similar hairlines. It's hard to tell if their eyes or eyebrows match up. Robert's age, height, weight, and how he dressed matched the suspect's description. And the timeline did too. He moved to Northern California and went missing just before the Zodiac Killer's first known murders. Imagine what it's like for Phil as he wonders if there's any connection.
There are some wild theories out there about who your father could have been. Do you want to know the truth, no matter what it is?
Yeah. Of course, yeah. I'd like to know one way or the other. They're trying to link him to what, the Zodiac Killer? Is that right? And he will, the time frame fits. Could he have gone? Was he a psychopath? Have he taken that dark trail? I don't know. I can't say. I mean, the person that I knew I would say no, he would never do something like that. No, he was just such a good-natured person.
It's hard for Phil to imagine his dad could have been the Zodiac Killer, but he admits there's so much he doesn't know about his dad. As we did our research, we took a closer look at the evidence, starting with their handwriting. At first glance, some handwritten letters from Robert and the Zodiac Killer seemed to match, and both had poor spelling. I took a close look at letters from Robert to his family with his capital block lettering, next to ones from the Zodiac Killer ciphers, also in capital block lettering. While I found similarities, I also found discrepancies with certain letters of the alphabet, and the letters the Zodiac Killer wrote to police were in lowercase. I didn't have any letters from Robert in lowercase to compare. Marshall Elliott gave us some insight into handwriting analysis.
Yeah, his handwriting is kind of telling, and usually people typically don't change their handwriting over the period of time. They always remain consistent in that.
He looked into it, but found no physical evidence linking Nichols to the Zodiac Killer. For now, he's moved on to other theories.
So you don't think this is an innocent, simple reason why he gave up that name?
I don't think people go to that extent to just run from a family.
Just this one guy.
Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the forensic scientist who helped crack his real identity, doesn't buy the Zodiac Killer theory.
We looked into maybe there was some speculation he was the Zodiac Killer. Don't take that too seriously, okay? Everybody looks like the Zodiac Killer. Even me, if I...
With the glasses.
Yeah, right.
Robert's son Phil still has so many questions. They'd been separated by just a 4-hour drive in the same state. Why would a father never reach out to his son and live under a stolen identity for so long? What was Robert hiding?
What did he do for those 20 years? You know, what was happening? He obviously had to be living somewhere.
All of those years on the run, did someone close to Robert Nichols know where he was? His son believes so. Phil feels like he was so close to finding out, but he missed his chance.
Do you think any family members or friends maybe knew where he was that whole time? Do you think he kept in touch with anyone?
I believe he kept in touch with his brother Marvin.
Phil hadn't seen his Uncle Marvin since the 60s until he showed up at his grandmother's funeral.
He just said, would you be interested in finding out about your dad? And that's when it dawned on me who it was. And I said, not particularly, I'm still mad at him, but I said, Mom would sure love to know where he's at because he owes child support for 20 years.
He regrets that answer to this day.
If I could have a do-over, I would say yes, I would love to get in contact with it. Just to kind of set things straight.
Phil never saw his Uncle Marvin again. He passed away, and he lost his chance to find out anything more.
Going to your grandmother's funeral, and he's not there at his own mother's funeral.
Right.
Missing big milestones.
That speaks of paranoia to me.
Could paranoia or PTSD be the reason Robert Nichols disappeared, stole a little boy's identity, and hid for more than 2 decades? For police, it's hard to imagine that was enough.
Yeah, the motive, the pure motive would always help, kind of that final piece.
And really, how could you live that many years like this? I mean, it must have been hard life for the guy.
U.S. Marshals have looked into all kinds of theories, from an Alcatraz escapee to a serial killer, a bank robber, a war criminal, or a spy. But they came up with no hard evidence linking to Robert. Could solving the reason why Robert Nichols was hiding crack another big case out there somewhere? U.S. Marshals are looking at unsolved murders in California right now.
There's one thing out there that we're missing that we just haven't been able to find yet. I just don't know what that one thing is. There's something, but I feel in my gut that there is something significant out there.
Sometimes Phil wonders how life would have turned out if he could go back in time and change another decision he made as a teenager.
Dad had come over to the house, wanted to know if I would come and live with him. He would take custody of me. I said, no, why would I want to do that, But I do remember the last thing I said to him. is go to hell. And I'm 16 years old, and I'm walking out the back door of the house, and just telling him, go straight to hell. And my gosh, it is, I wish I'd never said that.
Robert never met any of his 14 grandchildren. His disappearance and double life continues to ripple across the generations that have come after him.
I don't have the animosity. You know, I'm not resentful. I'm not angry with him for leaving.
We visited Robert Nichols' final resting place outside of Cleveland, tracking down the name that wasn't his, a name he stole to disappear. We found it etched next to other names on a small granite mausoleum built to hold urns of ashes inside. Maybe the answers everyone is looking for died with Robert Nichols. And here at this cemetery on a hill in northeastern Ohio, all that remains is the name Joseph Newton Chandler engraved in stone. A reminder that we really don't know much about this mysterious man at all.
What would you have said to him or asked him if you had the chance?
I would have went up to visit and tried to reconcile, especially after I got sober. You know, I've come to realize there are so many more important things in life, and family is one of them.
The U.S. Marshal's Office isn't giving up hope they'll solve this case one day. They could be one tip away from finding out why Robert Ivan Nichols was running. If you have any information, call U.S. Marshals at 1-866-4-WANTED. I'm Sara Goldenberg. Thanks for listening to Dark Side of the Land.
Subscribe now for future episodes and find more Dark Side of the Land and photo galleries related to these cases at cleveland19.com.